Voluntary registration. 1. Overview of voluntary registration for VAT. In the UAE, VAT registration is mandatory for businesses that exceed the mandatory registration threshold. However, businesses and persons that do not meet the mandatory threshold may still choose to voluntarily register for VAT. This option allows smaller businesses, startups, and entities with taxable expenses to opt into the VAT system. Voluntary registration can provide benefits, such as recovery of input tax and enhancing business credibility with partners and customers. The executive regulation may further specify processes and evidential requirements to support a voluntary registration application. 2. Conditions for voluntary registration eligibility. A person, including a business or legal entity, may apply for voluntary VAT registration if one of the following conditions is met. A. Past supplies or expenses exceed voluntary threshold. The person can voluntarily register if, at the end of any calendar month, the person can demonstrate that either of the following has occurred during the previous 12-month period. The total value of taxable supplies made by the person has exceeded the voluntary registration threshold, or the total value of taxable expenses incurred by the person has exceeded the voluntary registration threshold. This means that even if the person's taxable turnover is low, they can still voluntarily register if they incur significant taxable expenses, such as purchasing taxable goods or services. B. Future expected supplies or expenses to exceed voluntary threshold. Alternatively, the person can apply for voluntary registration if they anticipate that within the next 30 days, either of the following will occur. The total value of anticipated taxable supplies will exceed the voluntary registration threshold, or the total value of anticipated taxable expenses will exceed the voluntary registration threshold. This allows businesses that expect to scale up quickly or incur high initial taxable expenses, such as investments in inventory or equipment, to apply for VAT registration in advance. 3. Proof and documentation requirements. To support the voluntary registration application, the person will need to provide supporting evidence to the Federal Tax Authority, FTA, such as historical financial records for the past 12 months showing taxable supplies and expenses, forecasted revenue and expense projections for the upcoming 30 days, copies of invoices, contracts, and purchase orders demonstrating the taxable nature of the supplies and expenses. The executive regulation will define the exact procedures, evidence, and format required to process voluntary registration applications. 4. Benefits of voluntary registration. Voluntary registration allows businesses to issue tax invoices to customers, collect VAT from customers on taxable supplies, claim input tax credits on eligible business expenses. It also signals to customers and suppliers that the business is compliant with UAE VAT law, operating transparently within the VAT system. 5. Important considerations after voluntary registration. Once voluntarily registered, the person must comply with all VAT obligations, including submitting VAT returns periodically, maintaining accurate VAT records, charging VAT correctly on all applicable supplies. Voluntary registration is a commitment a voluntarily registered person cannot later ignore VAT compliance obligations just because their turnover remains below the mandatory threshold. If the person later decides to deregister, they must follow the formal deregistration process outlined in the VAT law and regulations. For more details, contact us.